On February 12, 1962, the sun rose gently over Christchurch, New Zealand. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue washed clean by a light overnight rain. A perfect day for flying. At the small airport, a de Havilland DH-89 Dragon Rapide, affectionately nicknamed the Dragonfly, sat quietly on the tarmac. Its twin engines gleamed in the light. It was a small, sturdy aircraft, the kind used for scenic tours across the breathtaking southern Alps. That morning, it was scheduled to carry 5 people on what was supposed to be a spectacular sightseeing journey to the remote and majestic Milford Sound. Among the passengers were a newlywed couple, a local journalist, a tourist from overseas, and the pilot Brian Chadwick, an experienced flyer known for his calm demeanor and deep knowledge of the unpredictable New Zealand weather. As they boarded, none of them could have known that they were stepping into one of the greatest unsolved aviation mysteries in New Zealand history. The Dragonfly lifted off around 10 a.m. It was expected to land at Milford Sound by midday. The route was scenic but treacherous, weaving through rugged mountain ranges where weather patterns could shift in an instant. Pilots were required to have deep familiarity with the terrain and constant attention to the sky. By 1 p.m., there had been no word, no radio contact, no landing confirmation. It wasn't until after 3 p.m. that the alarm truly rang out. The Dragonfly was missing. What began next would become one of the most exhaustive air and ground search operations in the nation's history. Over 80 aircraft and hundreds of volunteers scoured the mountains, valleys, and remote bushland between Christchurch and Milford Sound. The terrain was brutal, the weather often uncooperative. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and still no sign of the aircraft, no debris, no distress signal, no bodies. It was as if the Dragonfly had simply vanished into the mountains. Back in Christchurch, the families waited, at first with hope, then with anxiety, then with a growing sense of dread. For Joan Chadwick, Brian's wife, the silence became a prison. Every time the phone rang, her heart would leap. Every knock at the door sent her running, but the calls were never from Brian. The knocks never brought him home. Joan wasn't alone. Every family affected found themselves clinging to hope in different ways. Some believed, truly believed, that perhaps the plane had made an emergency landing in a remote, hidden valley, that the group was surviving on snowmelt and wild berries, awaiting rescue. Others held tight to the logic. No wreckage means they might be alive. They kept rooms untouched, clothes hung in closets, breakfast dishes set at the table every morning just in case. The newspapers ran headlines daily: search intensifies, still no sign, families hold hope. Radio hosts read out updates. Neighbors left casseroles at the doors of the missing. Strangers sent letters of encouragement, but the pain was personal, private, excruciating. For Marlene Price, whose brother Peter was the young journalist aboard the flight, the mystery consumed her. She spent sleepless nights poring over maps. She began to study aviation charts and storm patterns, desperate to find a clue that the experts had missed. Her husband begged her to rest. She couldn't. He's out there, she whispered to herself every night, and he needs me. Meanwhile, the search began to slow. The government issued statements. Resources were being stretched. Winter was approaching. By July, 5 months after the disappearance, the active search was officially scaled down. Families were told the same thing. We did all we could, but no one believed it was over. The Dragonfly had vanished completely. No oil slicks, no wing fragments, not even a shred of fabric. It was like a ghost flight, a phantom. As the years passed, the story slipped from the front pages, but not from the hearts of those left behind. Rumors swirled. Conspiracy theories emerged. Some said the aircraft had veered off course and crashed into a hidden glacier. Others claimed it had been mistaken for a military plane and accidentally shot down. There were even whispers of abduction, fanciful perhaps, but desperation knows no logic. The families held vigils, Year after year, some marked the date in silence, others organized memorials. Flowers were left in airports, mountains climbed, names engraved on stones, but the questions never stopped. Where is the Dragonfly? What happened to those 5 souls? And why, in an age of radio, radar, and rescue, could a plane simply vanish without a trace? In the weeks following the disappearance of the Dragonfly, silence became the loudest thing the families heard. The kind of silence that pressed against the windows, that sat across from you at the dinner table, that wrapped around your chest and refused to let go. It wasn't just the absence of news. It was the echo of 1,000 questions with no answers. For the Chadwick family, silence was especially cruel. Brian Chadwick had been a father, a husband, a veteran of the skies. He had flown missions during wartime. He had landed planes in storms that would have rattled less seasoned pilots. He was confident but never reckless. And now he was gone, without a word, without a warning. Joan Chadwick found herself caught between memories and moments that never arrived. She still set 2 plates for dinner. She still listened for his key in the lock. Their daughter, Emily, just 6 years old, asked every night when Daddy was coming home. Joan would stroke her hair and lie. "Soon, darling. He's just helping someone." But Joan knew. Mothers and wives always know. The part they can't explain is how much it hurts to still hope. Marlene Price had turned her grief into obsession. She was convinced, utterly convinced, that the search had ended too early. "How do you search the Southern Alps in a few weeks?" she argued. "There are valleys no one's ever walked, ice fields that could hide an entire house." She began corresponding with bush pilots, weather experts, survivalists. She learned about altitudes, wind shear, downdrafts. She studied flight plans like a military analyst. Not because she thought she could find the plane, but because doing nothing felt like betrayal. Her husband, Richard, watched with helpless frustration. "You're not sleeping," he told her once. "You're grieving yourself to death." Marlene stared out the window and said, "So what if I am?" In Invercargill, another family grieved differently. Margaret Walters, whose sister June was the tourist aboard the Dragonfly, stopped speaking to reporters altogether. She refused interviews, threw away newspapers, unplugged the radio. Her method of survival was to pretend it hadn't happened. She boxed up June's things, left town, and never looked back. "If the world can forget her," she muttered once, "then maybe I should too." But forgetting never truly works. Grief has a way of curling under the door, of slipping into your dreams. And while the families tried to move on, or stay behind, the world moved forward. Other headlines took over. A war flared somewhere, a new government was elected, children grew up, radios stopped playing the emergency broadcasts. But for those 5 souls and their loved ones, time had stalled at 10:02 a.m. On February 12, 1962, the last time the Dragonfly was seen, 10 years passed. By 1972, the Dragonfly mystery had become folklore. It was whispered about in flight clubs. New pilots were told the story like a ghost tale. "Don't stray too far west of Mount Aspiring," one would say. That's where the Dragonfly disappeared. But for the families, it was no legend. It was daily life. Some had given up. Others had found new routines. A few, like Marlene, kept looking. Every few months, a rumor would spark hope. A hiker found metallic debris. Someone saw an old wing poking through ice. A hunter heard engine sounds echoing in a canyon. Each time, the authorities would investigate. Each time, it led to nothing. The hardest part wasn't that the Dragonfly was gone. It was the not knowing. Was it quick? Did they suffer? Did they survive the crash, only to perish slowly in the wilderness? Did they wait for rescue that never came? Families would argue over these questions during holiday dinners, their grief tangled in anger. "I think they died on impact," one would say, like a mercy. "I think they're still out there," another would counter, like a curse. In 1985, a memorial was erected in Christchurch, listing the names of the 5 aboard. It was a quiet, modest affair. Few attended. Most of the families had grown weary of ceremonies. Joan Chadwick went, placing a single rose beneath Brian's name. She stood for 10 minutes, said nothing, and left. Later that year, a retired military pilot named Desmond Holloway claimed he knew where the plane went down. "There's a valley," he said, "west of Mount Irene, narrow, deep. Fog settles there year-round. I flew over it once, saw something shiny, but no one ever found it, or if they did, they never told." And so the story of the Dragonfly remained suspended in a strange limbo. Not a tragedy with closure, but a wound that never fully bled out. To the world, it was mystery. To the families, it was a quiet scream that never stopped echoing. By the time the Dragonfly had been missing for 20 years, it had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a plane. It was a symbol, a question carved into the mountains themselves. And for the families, it had taken on a life of its own, a shadow that followed them into marriages, into jobs, into quiet moments when no one else was watching. Marlene Price, now in her 50s, still kept a map on the wall of her study. Red pins marked locations that had been searched. Blue pins marked theories. There were yellow ones too. Those represented places she believed hadn't been searched well enough. The map had become almost sacred. Her husband Richard knew better than to suggest taking it down. Their children had grown up seeing it every day. That's where Uncle Peter might be. Marlene used to whisper to them before bed. She still believed. She needed to. Brian Chadwick's daughter Emily, now a grown woman with children of her own, rarely spoke of the Dragonfly. For years, she had carried a quiet rage, not just over the loss of her father, but over the way the world had tucked the mystery into a box labeled unsolved and moved on. People would ask about it with morbid fascination. "Wasn't your dad on that plane?" they'd say at parties. "That one that just vanished?" She learned to smile politely and say yes. What she never told them was how she used to dream that he'd come walking down the driveway, older now, weathered, but alive. Margaret Walters, who had once shut the world out completely, found herself reopening doors she thought had long since been locked. One night, after a documentary aired on national television about New Zealand's greatest aviation mysteries, she found herself standing in front of her sister's old suitcase, the one she never had the courage to open. She placed it on the bed, sat down, and with trembling hands, unlatched it. Inside were June's dresses, still folded, and a guidebook to Milford Sound. The pages were marked with little stars and notes in the margins. "Ask about boat tours," one said. "Bring extra film." Margaret ran her fingers over the ink, and for the first time in decades, she cried. None of the families had ever received a single piece of physical evidence. No wreckage, no personal effects, not even a scrap of the aircraft's interior. That was what made the grief different. It was intangible. It had no anchor. Closure requires evidence, something to bury, something to hold. But the Dragonfly had left them with only stories, and stories, while powerful, cannot be touched. In 1992, a group of amateur searchers, 3 bush pilots, a geologist, and a mountaineering guide, organized their own expedition. They believed they had identified a potential crash site in the Barrier Range. Their theory was detailed, precise, built on a combination of historic flight paths and unsearched ravines. They hiked out for 7 days, found nothing, just more snow, more silence. One of them later told the press, "It's like the mountains swallowed it, not a trace, not even an echo." That quote stuck with Marlene Price. She wrote it in her journal and underlined it twice. Then she added beneath it, "or someone made it disappear," because as the years passed, the theories had evolved. Some believed in the simplest explanation, a crash into the ice, the wreck buried forever. Others weren't so sure. There were whispers about a wrong turn, accidental military interception, even sabotage. Of course, none of these had evidence. But that's what happens when nothing is found. Imagination fills the void. Emily Chadwick eventually began working with a writer on a book about her father. She wanted to focus not on the crash, but on who he had been. The stories he told, the way he taught her to ride a bike, his pilot logbooks filled with neat handwriting and little notes. Smooth skies today, or Emily's birthday tomorrow. It became her way of reclaiming his story from the void. Not as the pilot of a lost plane, but as a man with a life. The writer asked her, during one of their last interviews, what she thought had happened. Emily took a long breath. "I think they crashed," she said quietly. "And I think they waited for as long as they could. I think he looked after the others. I think he rationed supplies. I think he wrapped someone in his jacket. I think he died trying to get help." She paused. "And I think I still miss him every single day." The book was published. It didn't make headlines, but it reached the right people. Families, survivors of other disappearances, strangers who needed to believe that love outlasts loss. And still, the Dragonfly remained unfound, but not forgotten. It was the 50th anniversary of the disappearance when they gathered again. Not all the families, but enough to feel the weight of time. The memorial in Christchurch had been cleaned, its stone now smoother from the brush of weather and fingers alike. Small bouquets lay at its base. Notes tucked beneath rocks fluttered slightly in the breeze. Most had been written recently by children or grandchildren who had never met the people they were mourning. Marlene Price arrived early, just as the sun cracked over the hills. Her hands were thinner now, her body slower, but her mind still sharp. She carried a faded photo of Peter and placed it quietly by the stone. No words. She'd said everything she needed to over the years, in journals, in letters, in dreams. Emily Chadwick came later with her son. He was 12, curious and bright-eyed, and had memorized every detail of his grandfather's disappearance. He asked questions other adults were too tired to ask. What did the plane look like? Why didn't they find it? Do you think they crashed into a lake? Emily answered gently, with that strange mix of honesty and protection every parent eventually learns. "We don't know," she said, "but we never stopped caring." Some reporters were there too, though fewer than in past years. The Dragonfly wasn't headline news anymore. The world had moved on to new disasters, new mysteries, but one journalist, a young woman from Wellington, approached Emily with a different kind of question. "What does it mean," she asked, "to love someone you lost before you really knew them?" Emily thought about it. Her answer came slowly. "It means learning to love the absence," she said. "It means growing up with stories instead of hugs, with pictures instead of memories. It means building a relationship with a ghost, one that never quite leaves." The reporter nodded. "And does that ghost ever get quieter?" Emily smiled, almost sadly. "Sometimes, but never completely." That evening, when the families had gone and the memorial stood quiet again, the wind picked up through the trees. A kind of hush fell over the field. It was easy to imagine, just for a moment, the sound of propellers slicing through the sky, the brief flash of silver over the mountains. Because the truth was, no one really believed the Dragonfly was lost forever. They believed it was waiting. Somewhere deep in the southern Alps, beneath ice or forest or time itself, it waited to be found. And when it was, someone would cry. Not just for closure, but for connection, for proof that the people they had loved weren't just stories or names carved in stone. Until then, they would keep gathering, keep remembering, keep searching, in the world and in themselves. In the quiet corners of Te Anau, where the road narrows and the land begins to rise into the cragged arms of the southern Alps, there's a local pilot named Jack Renner who flies a small aircraft for tourists. He knows the region like the back of his hand, but he also knows its secrets. Like many who've flown over those mountains, he's heard the stories. And sometimes, on longer flights, when the passengers are quiet and the air is smooth, he tells them about the Dragonfly. He doesn't dramatize it. There's no need. The facts themselves are enough to chill. A plane vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no emergency signal, no survivors, just silence. And a stretch of wilderness so vast and unforgiving it could swallow steel and bone alike. Jack's father had flown in the original search in 1962. He'd spent 3 weeks guiding military crews into remote passes and circling tight valleys where wreckage might have been hidden. They were looking in the wrong places, he'd told Jack once, long after he'd retired. There's a ridge out there, south of Mount Ward, steep, shaded, treacherous. I always had a feeling, but we never got clearance to search it properly. That conversation haunted Jack. He kept a copy of the Dragonfly's last flight plan in his drawer. A few times a year, when the weather allowed and the skies were kind, he would make a detour near that ridge. He never saw anything, but he always looked. The idea that something so large, an entire aircraft, 5 people, could disappear in a world with satellites and maps and search teams was unthinkable. And yet, that was the cruel magic of New Zealand's southern spine. It wasn't a place that gave up its secrets easily. Elsewhere, Marlene Price had been working with a local historian to create a digital archive of the Dragonfly case. Hundreds of newspaper clippings, personal letters, photos, and audio recordings had been scanned and catalogued. It was an act of preservation, but also of faith. If we keep telling the story, she said, someone will remember something, someone will see something. The historian, a young woman named Olivia Mann, approached the project with reverence. She interviewed surviving relatives, former rescuers, meteorologists, even old military staff who had flown missions during the search. What she found was a pattern: tiny discrepancies in flight logs, weather reports that didn't quite match, and a single strange note in a now declassified air traffic file that read, "Unconfirmed visual contact, object matching dimensions, dismissed due to terrain shadow." That line kept Olivia up for days. She tracked down the pilot who had written it. He was 87, living in a retirement village in Dunedin. When she visited, he didn't remember the note at first, but when she showed him a copy, something flickered in his eyes. "I saw something," he said slowly. "It was shiny, about the size of a small aircraft, half buried, but the sun was low and we were ordered back to base. They told me it was probably nothing. I was young, I didn't argue." Olivia asked where it was. He pointed shakily to a spot on a map, near Mount Ward, the same ridge Jack Renner had always wondered about. When Olivia reached out to Jack, she expected hesitation, but instead she found a kindred spirit. Within days, they were planning a joint flight. Jack prepped his aircraft, brought extra fuel, mapped emergency landings. Olivia packed a camera, a GPS tracker, and a small notebook filled with names and dates. On the morning of their flight, the air was cold and thin. Clouds hugged the peaks like restless ghosts. Jack flew low, cautious, alert. Olivia scanned the ridges through binoculars, her hands trembling. For nearly 2 hours, they saw nothing. Then, as the sun dipped behind a distant summit, Olivia gasped. "There," she said, pointing. Jack banked the plane hard, circling back. Below them, partially obscured by snow and shadow, was a glint, just a glint. But it was enough. Not rock, not ice, something else. Neither spoke as they marked the coordinates. It wasn't confirmation, not yet. But it was the first sign in over 50 years that maybe, just maybe, the Dragonfly wasn't lost, just hidden. And for the families who had waited so long, hope flickered again. The coordinates were passed quietly between hands, like something sacred. Jack Renner and Olivia Mann didn't speak to the media, not yet. They both understood what this might be and what it might not be. Over the decades, there had been false leads, misidentifications, flickers of hope that burned out faster than they had appeared. But this felt different. It wasn't rumor. It was light reflecting off something in a place where nothing should have been. They contacted the Department of Conservation under a private request for access. The region surrounding the Mount Ward Ridge was notoriously unstable, subject to sudden rockfalls, snowdrifts, and near-impossible terrain. Reaching it on foot would take days, And even then, there was no guarantee the object was accessible. Olivia, fueled by both professional instinct and something more primal, prepared herself for the wait. Government approval moved at glacial pace, and snow was already creeping back into the valleys with the early whisper of winter. While they waited, Jack returned to his usual flights, saying nothing. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. He flew over the ridge twice more, always from a slightly different angle. And each time, that same flicker was there, a pale metallic gleam where the earth should have been matte and grey. He captured photos, though the distance and angles made them inconclusive. Still, he sent them to Olivia with one line: "It's still there." Olivia, meanwhile, began collecting silent testimonies. She contacted a few of the families, just those she'd already worked with. She told them nothing was confirmed, but something had been found, something that might be a lead. Marlene Price didn't speak for a long time when Olivia told her. She simply stared out the window, clutching her teacup. Then she whispered, "Don't give me hope unless you're ready to take it away again." Emily Chadwick was more open. She asked questions. Could it really be? Why now? Would there be remains, evidence, a nameplate? She didn't know what she hoped to find. Closure, maybe, or something tangible to hold on to, something to tell her children, "This is where your grandfather's story ended, not in a newspaper column, but here, in this place." The department finally gave limited approval for a ground reconnaissance. A small team of 3, including a high-altitude rescue ranger, a local climber, and Olivia herself, were given a 5-day window with strict emergency protocols. Jack offered to fly them in as close as possible, landing on a narrow flat near the base of the ridge. From there, it would be a brutal ascent. The weather was expected to hold for 3 days, then storms would roll in. They went in quietly, no press, no announcements. The families knew that was enough. On the second day, the team reached the crest of the ridge. The wind was fierce, biting, unpredictable. Olivia's legs trembled, but not from fatigue. She was standing at the edge of something that could redefine 50 years of silence. Then they saw it. Not a full wreck, not even a fuselage, but a fragment, weathered, warped, bent against a rock face, a shard of aluminum, barely visible under decades of ice and scree. And beside it, lodged between stone and snow, something that stopped Olivia cold. A badge, faded, corroded, but the letters were still there. DH-89. She collapsed to her knees. There were no remains, not yet. No clothing, no personal effects, but there was no denying it now. This was part of the Dragonfly. The mountain had kept its secret long enough. They took photos, marked GPS, left it untouched, as instructed. When they returned, they handed over everything to the authorities. The news broke within a week. Families were contacted, media swarmed, historians celebrated, but through it all, the only voices that truly mattered were the ones that had waited the longest. Marlene sat with the photo in her lap and said nothing, just nodded. Finally, after 5 decades. Emily stood in front of her children and said, "He's still up there, but now we know where." The Dragonfly hadn't vanished. It had been waiting. The discovery sent quiet tremors through every life it touched. For the families, it was not just about the aircraft fragment or the worn badge with DH-89 etched into fading metal. It was about truth, finally stepping out from under the weight of mystery. They didn't need to see wreckage spread across a mountaintop or personal effects left in the snow. That single shard of aluminum, weathered but undeniable, was enough to crack open the vault that grief had sealed decades earlier. For Marlene Price, the news came like a distant echo, a whisper she had been chasing for over 50 years. She held the printed photograph in her hands, tracing its contours with fingers that had searched maps and written countless letters to ministries, news editors, and aviation experts. She didn't cry. She had done that too many times in too many empty rooms. Instead, she said quietly to her husband, "Peter waited long enough." She didn't ask to go up the ridge. Neither did Emily Chadwick. They understood that the mountain was not kind to the living either. But both women sent something instead. Marlene, a folded letter tucked inside a waterproof case. Emily, a small metal pendant her father had given her when she was a child, engraved with the words, "Sky above, earth below, peace within." They asked that the items be placed near the discovery site when the next expedition returned in summer, once conditions improved. The government issued a statement confirming the identification of the wreck fragment. There was talk of a formal operation to search for more debris, perhaps even remains. But everyone knew the truth. After all this time, nature might have erased almost everything. What mattered now wasn't what could be retrieved, but what had already been found. A beginning of closure. Jack Renner, who had refused any spotlight, sat alone in his hangar one evening, looking at the series of photographs they had taken from the air. He laid them out across a workbench like puzzle pieces. Even with the evidence confirmed, he couldn't stop replaying the moment they first saw the glint. How quiet Olivia had gone, how the mountain itself had seemed to pause. He wondered if it had all been fate, or persistence, or just listening to the ghosts that had whispered for so long. Olivia Mann, meanwhile, had become the unintentional face of the rediscovery. News outlets requested interviews. She declined most of them. She wasn't interested in turning tragedy into spectacle. Instead, she began writing a book, maybe, or a record, something honest, something that didn't just detail the coordinates and search paths, but the people, the grief, the refusal to let a story go silent. She reached out to the families one by one, not for quotes, but for memories. She asked each of them the same question: what do you want the world to remember? Marlene said that Peter was kind, that he took photographs because he believed everyone had a story. Emily said that my father loved the sky, and that he taught me to be brave even when the world gives you nothing but silence. One family sent a recording, a scratchy tape made in 1961, a Christmas message from the missing passenger to his parents, found at the bottom of an old drawer. His voice, light and full of promise, played softly in Olivia's office one evening. She listened with her eyes closed. It was only a minute long, but in that minute the weight of 50 years lifted a little. As word of the discovery spread, strangers began leaving flowers at the Christchurch Memorial again. Messages were tucked into the edges of the stone. A schoolchild wrote, "Now they can rest." An elderly man left a folded flight map with a single note: "We never stopped searching." For the first time, the memorial felt complete. But something else happened too. Something no one had anticipated. People began to talk, not just about the Dragonfly, but about all the ones who never came home. Missing hikers, lost boats, disappeared aircraft, forgotten tragedies. The rediscovery of the Dragonfly gave voice to a wider grief, and through that it offered something rare: permission to hope. Hope not necessarily for recovery, but for recognition. For the missing to be remembered not as mysteries, but as people whose lives mattered long after the world stopped looking. That was the true gift the mountain had finally given back. In the weeks that followed the official announcement of the Dragonfly's partial discovery, the pace of life for the families involved shifted into something almost surreal. For so many years, the pain had existed in a kind of limbo, never resolved, never fully acknowledged, like a note held too long without release. Now that there was proof, something tangible to point to, the very shape of their grief changed. It became sharper in some ways, but lighter in others. The pain had a place to go. Marlene found herself waking up earlier without the heaviness that had defined so many mornings. There was still sorrow, of course. She still had moments where she stared at Peter's old letters and whispered apologies into the air. But now, when she spoke his name, it didn't feel like calling out into a void. It felt like laying down flowers on a grave. There was a strange comfort in knowing where he had likely taken his final breath, even if she would never walk those ridges herself. Her grandchildren, curious and eager to understand, began asking questions that no one in the family had asked in decades. What kind of stories did Uncle Peter write? Did he ever want to be a pilot too? Marlene, who once struggled to say his name without tears, now found herself telling them about his first published article in the Otago Daily Times. How he always carried two notebooks, one for facts, one for feelings. How he believed that even the smallest life held something worth writing down. Those stories became a kind of resurrection, not of the body, but of the man. Emily Chadwick took a different path. For years, she had avoided the media, kept her father's memory contained within the borders of family and silence. But after the wreckage was confirmed, she felt something change in her. It wasn't just closure, it was the realization that her father's story had reached beyond them, had become part of New Zealand's fabric of memory. People stopped her on the street. They told her they remembered, that they were sorry, that they had always wondered what had happened. She realized then that his disappearance had not disappeared at all. It had endured in whispers, in old headlines folded into scrapbooks, in the half-remembered tales of elder pilots. One afternoon, she returned to the small airstrip where her father had last taken off. It was different now, modernized, expanded, no longer the quaint gravel field of the 60s. But she found a quiet bench nearby and sat for a long time, watching the small planes take off and disappear into the same sky he'd vanished into decades before. It didn't hurt to watch them. That surprised her. In fact, it brought her a strange peace. They were still flying. People were still chasing the clouds, just like he had. Elsewhere, the impact of the discovery stretched beyond the immediate families. Amateur aviation historians reached out to Olivia Mann, asking for access to her research. Search and rescue veterans wrote to her, expressing gratitude for her persistence. And others, families with their own missing, their own unresolved stories, began sharing their experiences. Olivia had started with a single case, but she now found herself woven into a larger community of those who understood that disappearance was not just an event. It was a state of being, a wound that didn't bleed, but throbbed beneath the surface for generations. The government, moved by public interest, announced a plan to organize a full-scale recovery mission for the following summer. Not only to seek more wreckage, but to install a permanent marker near the discovery site, a memorial at the source, a gesture not only of remembrance, but of acknowledgement. It wasn't just about those 5 lives. It was about all those lost in the silence between transmission and impact. Emily was invited to write the inscription. She kept it simple. It read, "Here ended the flight of the Dragonfly, not forgotten, not erased. They flew into silence, but they are heard now." When Jack Renner read it, he said nothing. He simply nodded and folded the paper into his flight jacket. He still flew that route from time to time, not because he needed to, but because it felt right. He said he liked knowing the air had finally given up its secret, even if only in part. Sometimes, when the sun was low and the air was calm, he thought he could hear the faint hum of another engine beside him, a companion flight. Nothing more, nothing less. As the year turned, snow fell again over the ridge near Mount Ward. Nature reclaimed its hush. But now, beneath that hush, there was a thread of presence, a knowledge that they had been found, that the years of not knowing had ended. And in homes across the country, some filled with photos, others with only shadows, people sat a little straighter, spoke the names of the missing a little louder. There was no triumph, no great moment of revelation, only truth, quiet, heavy, but finally, whole. As winter yielded to spring in the southern hemisphere and the snow began to shrink back from the edges of the ridge where the Dragonfly had been found, a quiet momentum stirred in the lives of those the tragedy had touched. There were no grand ceremonies yet, no public unveilings, But in living rooms and letters, in quiet moments beneath trees or beside photo frames, people were beginning to process not just the discovery, but what it meant to finally know, even if only a little. Olivia Mann was one of the few who didn't allow herself much time to rest. The more the story spread, the more messages poured in. A niece of one of the passengers who had been born after the crash wrote to her from Melbourne. She had grown up with only a name and a photo in an album. Now, she was planning to visit New Zealand for the first time in her life. Another email came from an elderly man who had worked at the airport in Christchurch the day the Dragonfly departed. "I remember loading the camera bags," he wrote. "I remember the laughter. They were all excited. It was just another day then. I never forgot them." She received more messages like these each day. They weren't just expressions of gratitude. They were offerings, bits of memory, emotion, glimpses of lives that had existed in the margins for far too long. Olivia began compiling them into a kind of living document, something she tentatively titled The Echoes Project. Her idea wasn't to retell the story as history, but to preserve it as testimony, not about the crash itself, but about everything that came after, the grief, the waiting, the silence, and now the soft return of presence. Meanwhile, a quiet plan began to take form among the families, a collective visit. Not to the ridge, most of them were too old for that kind of climb, but to a viewing point nearby, a lookout from which the range could be seen clearly on a good day. It wasn't formal, it wasn't even coordinated at first, but as they exchanged messages and calls, the idea gathered weight. Some would bring photos, others flowers. A few simply wanted to stand there and say nothing at all. Emily Chadwick was hesitant at first. Part of her felt that going would somehow make it too real, would cement the finality of what they had learned. But when her son asked if he could come with her, something shifted. It was no longer just her grief. It had become part of his inheritance, not a burden, but a truth, a piece of the story that shaped their family. On the morning of the gathering, a soft mist hung low over the valley. Around a dozen family members came, along with a few close friends and two of the original searchers who were still alive. They didn't speak much. There were no speeches, only presence. People stood in pairs or alone, their eyes lifted toward the peaks. Some clutched photos, others wore scarves that had once belonged to the missing. A few, like Marlene, stood with their eyes closed, listening, not for voices, but for the wind, for the place itself. At one point, Jack Renner appeared in the distance, circling overhead in his aircraft. He dipped his wings twice in silent tribute and continued on, disappearing behind a cloud line. When the mist cleared briefly, they could just make out the edge of Mount Ward. It was jagged and indifferent, as mountains always are, but beneath its silence, those who had come felt something. Maybe connection, maybe closure, maybe just a quiet promise that their waiting hadn't been in vain. Afterward, they sat together on picnic benches and shared tea, sandwiches, and stories. For the first time in years, laughter returned. Not loud, not carefree, but real. There was something healing in the simplicity of it, in the way people could lean into one another without needing to explain. Marlene shared a copy of Peter's last letter home. Emily passed around a childhood drawing she had made of her father flying a plane with stars around it. Another woman read a poem written by her aunt, one of the passengers, a poem about flight and fear and the joy of seeing the world from above. They didn't talk much about the crash, not directly. They talked about lives lived, the people they had been, the things they had loved. It was not a funeral, it was a reclaiming. In the following days, local papers ran quiet stories about the gathering. There were no headlines screaming about mysteries solved or bones recovered, just a few soft words about memory and the long, slow process of being found. Back in Christchurch, Emily stood once again at the memorial. She brought with her a new photo, her son standing beside the range, smiling into the mist. She placed it at the base of the stone and whispered, You were never truly lost. And now you've brought us home too. Far away on the ridge, the snow continued to melt in slow surrender to spring, and beneath it, the Dragonfly slept. The summer that followed was one of the warmest on record in Fjordland. The snow line receded farther than expected, bearing rocks and ridgelines that had remained buried for decades. It was nature's slow exhale, as if the mountain had been holding its breath for years and was finally willing to loosen its grip on secrets kept in silence. The conditions were ideal, and with the support of several government agencies and volunteers, a small but determined expedition was launched to return to the coordinates near Mount Ward for a full-scale recovery and investigation. This time, there was no fanfare, no cameras. The families had made it clear this was not a spectacle, it was sacred. Olivia Mann was invited to join the team again, not as a journalist, but as a custodian of the story. She was no longer just recording history, she was part of it now. With her went a geologist, a forensic anthropologist, a glaciologist, and a search and recovery expert. Together, they carried not just equipment, but intention. Not everything needed to be found, but anything that could be found deserved dignity. It took 2 days of slow climbing and drone-assisted scouting before the team reached a sheltered rock formation partially hidden beneath melting ice. There, tucked beneath layers of frost and debris, they uncovered additional fragments, some matching the aircraft's undercarriage, others twisted beyond recognition. Among them was the corner of a seat frame and part of a passenger window, fogged and cracked with age. Nothing was whole. Nothing untouched by time. The anthropologist moved carefully through the area, brushing away sediment with surgical delicacy. On the third morning, he found what they had quietly feared and hoped for: fragments of bone caught between layers of rock and moss. Nearby, buried in a shallow ice pocket, was the rusted frame of a camera. Its body was crumpled, the lens shattered, the film likely useless, but it had a name scratched into the metal casing: Peter. When the team descended days later, they carried these pieces with reverence. Each item was catalogued and handled with the same gravity as if it were a full body, because it was, in a way. They were fragments not just of metal and bone, but of the unanswered. For Marlene, the news was received in stillness. Olivia told her gently over tea, with no recording devices between them. She described where it had been found, how carefully it had been treated, and that the remains would be analyzed respectfully to determine identity, if possible. Marlene held her hands folded tightly in her lap and simply said, "Then he's not cold anymore." Other families were informed in private. Some declined to hear the details. Others asked for everything. For them, it was a second loss, but this time, it came with confirmation. There would be no wondering anymore if their loved ones had survived the crash and waited in vain. They had died there. Quickly, it seemed, likely on impact or shortly after. Together. Emily received a small envelope weeks later containing the pendant she had sent with the initial team, returned to her, wrapped in soft fabric, and accompanied by a short letter from the recovery team expressing gratitude for her trust. She didn't open it right away. She sat with it on her desk for hours, her hands resting lightly on top. When she finally did unwrap it, she found the pendant dulled by exposure, but intact. She cleaned it gently and wore it for the first time in decades. The memorial plans moved forward quickly after that. The New Zealand government, in collaboration with the families, announced the placement of a second marker, this one closer to the site itself. It would be inaccessible to most, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't for the world, it was for them. The inscription was expanded to include the names of all 5 on board, along with the words, "They flew into silence, they rest in peace." They were never forgotten. At the unveiling ceremony, Jack Renner stood beside Olivia, looking older, quieter. He hadn't spoken much since the recovery. When asked if he would fly over the ridge one more time, he nodded once and said, "For them, always." And so, in the late evening light, Jack took to the sky once again, circling above the ridge in silence. Below him, the families stood quietly beside the stone. Some closed their eyes, others lifted their faces to the sky. No one spoke. It was a kind of completion. Not the end of grief, but the end of the question. The Dragonfly's story would not be lost again. In the months after the recovery operation, the story of the Dragonfly quietly began to settle into the deeper currents of New Zealand's collective memory. It no longer lived as a headline, nor as a persistent whisper of speculation. Instead, it existed as something more solemn and whole, a completed chapter in the long, complicated history of loss and endurance. The families, after years of imagining and hoping and doubting and grieving, began the slow, difficult work of living with answers. For many of them, closure did not arrive like a light switched on in a dark room. It arrived like the sunrise through fog, gradual, incomplete, but undeniable. There were still bad days. There were dreams that brought the mountains back, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel. There were moments, walking past an airport or hearing the hum of a propeller, when everything would return in an instant. But what had changed was the weight. They no longer carried uncertainty. Now they carried memory. Emily Chadwick began compiling her father's letters, logbooks, and journal entries into a collection. She worked slowly, not to publish, but to preserve, driven by the desire that her children, and their children, would understand the man behind the pilot's uniform. She included photographs of her father, not just in the cockpit, but at the beach, cooking breakfast, laughing in the backyard. She called the binder, "For the Days You Never Saw." Her son read it, cover to cover, and later told her quietly, "I feel like I finally met him." Marlene Price spent more time in her garden that spring. The weeds had overtaken much of it during the chaos of the past year, but she welcomed the task of reclaiming it. Peter had always liked the lavender bushes best. She planted a new row of them along the fence, then placed a small engraved stone in the middle. It simply read, "Peter, found." One morning, Olivia received a package with no return address. Inside was a small model of the Dragonfly aircraft, painted carefully in the colors worn by the real plane in 1962. It was hand-carved, delicate. Along with it was a folded piece of paper with a single line in neat handwriting. "Thank you for helping us land." She never found out who sent it. The model remained on her desk, just beside her notes for a book she had decided, at last, to write. Not just about the Dragonfly, but about the human beings tethered to its story. She would write about the resilience of the families, the silence of the mountains, the way grief mutated and redefined itself over decades. And she would write about the search, not just for wreckage, but for peace. By late summer, the memorial site had become a quiet destination for those seeking reflection. Hikers passed by and left tokens, rocks painted with the word hope, old flight pins, scraps of poetry scribbled onto worn notebook paper. The Department of Conservation installed a small weather-resistant box nearby where visitors could leave notes. It filled quickly. Some messages came from strangers with no connection to the event who simply felt moved by the space. Others came from pilots who signed with their call signs and thanked the Dragonfly for the lessons it had left behind. There was no talk of turning the site into a museum or attraction. That had been made clear. This was not a story to be commercialized. It was something deeper, an echo chamber of memory where each footstep meant respect, not curiosity. Jack Renner continued to fly. Age had slowed him but not grounded him. He took fewer flights now, mostly locals, and never for show. Occasionally, someone would recognize him and ask about the Dragonfly. He rarely said much, but once, sitting outside the hangar with Olivia, he said quietly, "It didn't want to be found until the time was right." She asked, "Do you believe that?" He nodded once. "Yes. I think places remember. I think they wait." On the anniversary of the Dragonfly's disappearance the following February, a small ceremony was held. It wasn't formal. There were no microphones, just a gathering of the remaining families, some younger relatives, and a few people from the original search teams. They shared thermoses of tea, photographs, and a few long embraces. Someone played a recording of an old song from the 60s. A few tears were shed, but mostly there was peace. Emily stood near the edge of the lookout, her son beside her. He asked her, "Do you think Grandpa knew how much people loved him?" She looked up at the mountain ridge, bathed in golden light, and said, "I think he does now." The sun dipped behind the peaks. The wind moved gently through the trees. And far above, where air thins and time moves differently, the dragonfly rested where it had fallen, its story finally whole. In the years that followed the discovery, the dragonfly became something more than a tragedy, more than a mystery solved. It became a testament, a quiet reminder that some stories don't end when the engines stop or when the world goes quiet. Some stories stretch across time, carried in memory and silence, until someone listens closely enough to hear them again. There were no more expeditions after the memorial was placed. The ridge near Mount Ward was left undisturbed, just as the families had asked. What needed to be found had been found. What remained could stay there, held in the quiet guardianship of the mountains. No more bones would be chased, no more pieces of aluminum pulled from the ground. The dragonfly had returned to the earth, and that was where it would remain. Olivia Mann's book, Echoes Over the Alps, was published quietly and without fanfare. It was not a bestseller. It was not meant to be. But it found its way into libraries, into classrooms, into the hands of people who understood the weight of grief that never had a shape until now. It told the story through the voices of the families, the searchers, the land itself. It did not end with a neat answer. It ended with a question. How long does love echo after the voice is gone? In Christchurch, the original memorial still stood, now polished by the hands of time and softened by flowers regularly left by strangers. Tourists passed it often without knowing its full story. But those who did stop, who took the time to read the names and wonder what happened up there, were sometimes met with an older man or woman nearby, ready to share it. Emily Chadwick became one of those people. Every year, on the same date, she would bring a small chair and sit beside the stone. She never brought a sign, never called attention, but if someone asked, she would tell them, and she would say it not with pain, but with a kind of reverence, as though she were passing along the tale of a cathedral built from loss and perseverance. Her son, now nearly grown, sometimes came with her. Other times he went on his own, bringing his friends or classmates. They would stand in silence, read the plaque, and leave behind messages, not just for those who were lost, but for anyone who might feel forgotten. One afternoon, a teacher from Queenstown wrote to Olivia to say that her students had chosen the Dragonfly story for their final history project. They didn't want to write about wars or governments, the letter read. They said they wanted to write about people who never gave up, even when the world stopped listening. It was, in many ways, the perfect legacy. In the final months of her life, Marlene Price no longer kept Peter's map on the wall. She didn't need to. The red pins, the theories, the unsolved spirals had all settled into something still. She had seen the ridge with her own eyes, had touched the stone with his name on it, had finally whispered goodbye, not into nothing, but into a place. A real place. Her grandchildren kept her letters. When she passed, one of them placed a copy of Peter's final article in her hands before the casket was closed. It was about beauty in remote places. It ended with the line, "Even the loneliest mountains can tell a story, if you are quiet enough to listen." Jack Renner flew less frequently after the second winter, but he still maintained the aircraft himself, cleaned the windows, checked the fuel, ran the engines. It wasn't about flying anymore. It was about continuity, about knowing that there was still a machine capable of reaching the sky, just like the Dragonfly once had. Sometimes when he did take off, he flew west. Not to the ridge directly, but near enough to feel its presence. He would tip his wing, not for show, but as a salute, not to the dead, but to those who endured for them. As for the ridge itself, it remained unchanged. The seasons came and went, the snow returned, the winds howled. Trees bent, shadows lengthened, and the silence reclaimed its space. But in that silence lived the echo of something powerful, not despair, but devotion, not just to those who vanished, but to those who refused to let them disappear completely. The dragonfly, in the end, had never truly vanished. It had simply gone quiet until the world was ready to listen again. Now it was heard, and always would be.